Right. Welcome to this special edition of Destination Midway, where we commemorate the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. Hello, I'm Karl Zingheim, the staff historian for the USS Midway, and I'd like to welcome everyone here to our special location inside the Midway's own Tactical Flag Command Center, or TFCC. TFCC is now a carefully restored exhibit on board the Midway Museum, but in 1991, this high-tech command center was where the carrier air war in the Arabian Gulf sector of Desert Storm was actually waged. And so we're going to start off with a special commemoration in the very spaces from which the conflict was directed. This program, like all our others, of course, is interactive, and if you have any kind of comments or questions you'd like to contribute towards our program, please feel free to use our chat box feature, and we'll address them as we get towards the close of our program. Also, I'd like to be able to point out that if you'd like to make a donation on behalf of the USS Midway Museum, please visit our website at www.midway.org for details. Operation Desert Storm occurred in early 1991 as a response to the surprise Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait in August of 1990. In spite of continued attempts to try and negotiate a peaceful resolution, it became apparent that armed force was going to be necessary to eject the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Consequently, the United States in the following year, January of 91, led an international coalition of nearly 36 nations in finding a way to forcibly remove the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. This became Operation Desert Storm. This conflict was the first that occurred in the new post-war era following the protracted Cold War, and in fact is largely known today for being the showcase for the use of all the high-tech weaponry that had perfected the decade before while waging the Cold War against the Soviet Union. In fact, the popular perception of much of the Operation Desert Storm was the air war that featured the use of very high-tech precision weaponry that was a regular feature on television broadcasts of the combat as it went on. Basically, from a military standpoint, Operation Desert Storm was really a two-phase war. First, it was a protracted and concentrated aerial offensive against Iraqi defenses both in Iraq and in Kuwait to prepare the battlefield and to establish absolute aerial supremacy. Later, there was a ground segment where the ground forces were able to cross the frontiers and to liberate Kuwait and to badly damage Iraqi forces in southern Iraq. In fact, so effective was the aerial preparation during the air phase that the ground phase of the conflict lasted only 100 hours before the Iraqi forces requested a ceasefire. We're very honored today to be able to have 4 Navy veterans of Operation Desert Storm who each contributed in a unique way to the prosecution of this successful conflict. Joining us on board the Midway, right here in our own TFCC, is our own docent director, who is retired Navy Captain, Jim Riley.
Hi.
Jim was a career supply officer and was the supply department head on board the Midway during Operation Desert Storm. In fact, he had a myriad of responsibilities, which he'll elaborate upon, that went way beyond what would be considered the normal routine for a supply department on a fighting ship like the Midway. After Desert Storm, he became the executive officer of the San Diego Supply Center and later the commanding officer of the Defense Data Center in San Diego before retiring in 1996. In fact, in 2018, he was able to fleet up to become our new docent director here on the Midway. Joining us from a nation's capital is Senator Mark Kelly. He's the junior senator from Arizona. Senator Kelly began his naval aviation career as an A-6 intruder pilot, and at the time of Operation Desert Storm, he was flying with VA-115 aboard the Midway, known as the Eagles. He flew 39 combat missions during the course of Operation Desert Storm. Afterwards, he became a naval test pilot and logged over 5,000 hours in 50 different aircraft. In 1996, he was accepted into the astronaut program and eventually flew 4 shuttle missions aboard the Endeavour and the Discovery. He retired from both the Navy and from the NASA Astronaut Corps in 2011. Also joining us from Virginia is retired Navy Captain Jim Buren, who at the time of Operation Desert Storm was actually the commander of Midway's unique Airwing 5. He started his career as a Navy flight officer as a bombardier navigator on the A-6 Intruder, and this culminated in a command of VA-52 Night Riders Intruder Squadron before he became Midway's CAG. After Desert Storm, he had duty in Washington before becoming the superintendent of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey in 1995. He retired from the Navy in 1998. Joining us back here in TFCC as well is retired Navy Captain Dan Hacker. Dan actually began his career as an F-4 Phantom fighter pilot before transitioning over into the Viking community in the mid-1970s. The S-3 Viking was the first all-jet shipboard ASW platform for the Navy, and it was found to be necessary to be able to infuse some tactical jet experience into this community. His experience with the Vikings culminated in a command of both a deploying squadron, VS-29 Dragonfire, as well as the Viking component of the replacement air group, the VS-41 Shamrocks, here at Naval Air Station North Island. At the time of Operation Desert Storm, he was actually on the staff of Carrier Group 7 as Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations, which was on board USS Ranger, which had just joined the task forces off Iraq. After Desert Storm, he later fleeted up to command of Carrier Airwing 2 aboard the USS Constellation before his retirement. So thank you, gentlemen, and we're very honored to have you here. As a reminder, if you'd like to make a contribution to the USS Midway Museum, please visit our website. So with that, I'd like to be able to turn to our own Jim Riley here and to ask each of you in turn if you could briefly encapsulate what your particular service in Desert Storm has meant to you over the past 3 decades. Captain Riley?
Well, thank you. Yeah. Reflecting back on the Operation Desert Storm, I mean, first off, it doesn't seem like it could be 30 years since we were involved in that. And this may be something to do with my age and the way you view time, but yeah, it seems close to yesterday. I think that while we were preparing for the war and in the prosecution of the war, it was just inspirational to me to see how the sailors and the rest of the crew on the ship put in their very best efforts to make sure that we could have the aircraft fly for the 100 or so air crew, that they were able to complete their missions. And so as I look back at that, I think about that kind of teamwork and use that as an example in my later parts of the Navy career as well as in my civilian career. So very impactful to see that team come together, focused on one goal, and then successfully pursue and achieve that goal.
Thank you. Senator Kelly, what is your 30-year perspective?
$115, I'm not sure, or as the CAG. You know, Desert Storm was the first real significant conflict we had as a nation, especially with regards to an air war, since the Vietnam War. And I was a young junior officer. I got to Airwing 5 to VA 115 in 1989. And it was towards the end of my, first tour as a junior officer, as a pilot of an A6 Intruder. I think it's one of the things that defined my career in having the opportunity to serve my country in that way when our nation was in a conflict, when this was a pivotal point in our country's history, when we were trying to defend an ally who was under attack. And I learned a lot during that conflict. I learned a lot about myself, about my squadron mates, about leadership from folks like Captain Buren, our CAG, and my skipper, a guy named Terry Toms, who has passed away, but who I really respected. And I think that whole experience just defined, for me, what it meant, to be a leader in a challenging time. And I tried to take some of those lessons as I went forward throughout my career, not only at in the Navy, but at NASA, and now in the United States Senate.
Thank you, Senator. Captain Buren, what's your perspective?
Well, first of all, let me say that it was a real honor and pleasure to have been the CAG on the Midway for Desert Storm. It was a unique opportunity. They talk about Airwing and ship teams, and before I went to CAG 5, I was at AirTAC, which is the commander for all the carriers and Airwings. And I was, one of my tasks was to evaluate all of them before they went on deployment. And so I got to see every Airwing ship team, and they all said, yeah, our Airwing ship team is great, and we work together. There was nothing like Midway and CAG 5. I mean, it was almost one unit and not an Airwing ship. They were just together. It was really amazing. Desert Storm itself was a really time of transition. So we were there for Desert Shield also. And so Midway flew many sorties, basically just kind of biding time to see what was going to happen in Kuwait and Iraq. We went from Desert Shield to Desert Storm. We went from initially planning long-range strikes with Air Force tanking to going into the Persian Gulf and doing tanking ourselves. We went from flying low, and I'm sure Mark has heard the T-Toms and everybody else stories about the first night going low, to going to medium altitude. We went from strategic targets, airfields, power plants, communications facility, to tactical targets, ships, kill boxes. Most impressive to me, the most impressive transition, and maybe it was just Midway magic, but we went from, as Mark well knows, we went from flying training sorties with blue bombs to combat sorties with big bombs overnight. It just happened. From the CAG 5 perspective, the flight deck, supply, ordnance, everything on Midway was, everything we needed was there. Bottom line is, the CAG 5 Midway team flew more sorties per day and dropped more ordnance per day than any of the other 5 carriers out there, which is not bad for a 45-year-old carrier with 2 cats and 3 wires. So that was my perspective.
Thank you. Captain Hacker, what's your perspective from 30 years on?
Well, I think I'm coming from a little different perspective, since I wasn't on Midway during Desert Storm, but I was on Ranger, as Karl said earlier. We were the carrier with the best timing. Pulled into the Persian Gulf one day before the hot war started. And so we had been preparing as we were coming through the Indian Ocean, and as soon as we got there, it started. And on Ranger, we were assigned as Alpha Sierra in the Persian Gulf. So we had a one specific part of the war, which was maritime superiority, and we used everybody in the Persian Gulf, including other nation navies, of course all of U.S. aviation assets. And my overwhelming amazement at the time was, even though there were a few hiccups to start with, but it had been the first big exercise as composite warfare, and it worked pretty well. And it's been enhanced ever since. And my best memory of that is how well it worked and how it helped prepare me for some of my later jobs, such as Airwing Commander.
Thank you. For those of our viewers who are just tuning in, this is a special edition of Destination Midway commemorating the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. We're going to shift gears here and go into some questions directly for our panelists here, and we'll start, of course, with our own Captain Riley here. And the first question I'd like to ask is, while many can imagine what the myriad responsibilities are for running a supply department that's in charge of keeping a floating city like an aircraft carrier going, how, if any, if at all, did it change in wartime conditions?
Well, the intensity was higher in wartime, the wartime conditions, and the consumption rates went up for things like fuel and, of course, ordnance and that type of stuff. The rest of it was a change from basically 16, 18 hours a day to full 24 hours a day. So you could get food, you could drop off your laundry, you could get a haircut, anything like that, 7 by 24. And that was to support the air wing and the air crew who were flying at all kinds of different hours. And so from a supply perspective, which is everything that you have to keep the ship going, it's a switch to basically 24/7 operations.
When you consider that you probably had maybe 100 aviators, combat aviators actually on the Midway, how many people did it really take to support them to be able to accomplish their mission flying from a carrier and getting out and hitting the target?
Well, very narrowly, from a supply perspective, it was about 550 people. But realistically, everybody on the ship was on the ship to support the aviators and the air crew. So the ship had 4,500 people. I think you're right, in the vicinity of 100. That 4,400 were all dedicated to supporting the air wing and the aviators.
Thank you, Captain Riley. Senator Kelly, one thing that was really a standout for the public's perception of Operation Desert Storm, of course, is the deliverance of all that precision ordnance. And a lot of the imagery that was included in the newscasts and later in archival footage really made it look like it was a simple matter to be able to put the ordnance on target. However, that probably wasn't the case. Could you describe for us how intensive the training is for an attack crew to be able to accomplish that kind of feat?
Well, let me start by saying I'll go backwards. So, CAG Buren said, we as a ship we were incredibly successful. We delivered more ordnance, from the Midway than from any other aircraft carrier. We did it with one arm tied behind our backs, in that we only had 2 catapults, not 4. We were a smaller deck. Midway was always harder to get aboard because of the angle of the deck and the roll. So there were issues, but because of the ability for us to coordinate as a team, not only one squadron with the other, but especially with the ship's company, to get the ordnance loaded, to get us off the front, to get us the extra gas we needed, to get us feet dry and back. I wouldn't say safely, because none of this is safe. It did take a lot of training, but when you were in Airwing 5, you were very well prepared, because we didn't really have workups. We showed up in a squadron, and we constantly operated at a tempo of operations that kept us rather current. Now, I don't want to give the impression that we hit every target every single time. I think some of us had pretty high success rates. Myself and my bombardier navigator, who I flew almost all my missions with, was a guy named Paul Fujimura. He actually lives in Annapolis, and he works for the TSA, and he's come over. He and his wife were going to do a socially distanced
dinner tonight here in Washington. But there were times when it was still hard. Generally, I can think of one occasion where Paul and I we came across two Iraqi Polnokny troop carrier ships. They were Russian ships that were purchased by the Iraqis, and they were trying to preserve their assets. And Paul and I were given the go ahead to roll in hot on these ships. And I think probably because of how I maneuvered the airplane, we dropped an LGB. The LGB missed. Barely, but it did miss the ship. And this is a laser-guided, precision 500-pound bomb that we were well prepared to deliver and usually had success, but sometimes things don't go exactly as you planned. I was able to get 2 Rockeye on the second ship, and then an F-18. Actually, another A-6 from my squadron came, and we were able to take out the 2 targets, myself and Paul on one of the ship, and a guy named Reggie Carpenter and his bombardier navigator on the other. But we did this a lot, right? We stayed current. We flew off in the Philippines and South Korea. We never got too far away from being able to launch and land on the carrier. We didn't do workups, and we trained a lot, often with those blue bombs. But to transition from the blue bomb to the live ordnance, if you're training well, and that's what we did in VA 115 and Airwing 5, we took this all so very seriously all the time. We were able to be very successful, and I know our squadron took out multiple bridges. I mean, myself, I sunk 2 ships. I hit targets at Shaiba Airfield, buildings inside Iraq and Kuwait, tanks, and so I think as a unit we were just very prepared to function at a very high level.
Senator, you endured 39 combat missions during Desert Storm. Is there any particular one that really stands out from the others?
Well, the couple ships, but I'd say that the one that really stands out is my first one. It was on the first day of the war. It was actually the second night, but I was flying at about 15,000 feet to Shaiba Airfield to drop some non-precision guided, I think there were 1,000 pounders or 2,000 pound, so Mark 83s or Mark 84s on a maintenance hangar at Shaiba Airfield. And after Paul Fujimura and we made this left-hand turn, we were inside this SA-6 missile envelope. I'll tell you, one of the worst feelings in the world is, looking down and seeing that missile come up at your airplane. I eventually had to do, as this missile was in its, very close to us, I did this last-ditch maneuver. It flies past us, detonates, and the airplane shook a little bit. I got it rolled, got it rolled heads up again. Look at the instrument panel. Both engines are still running. All 4 hydraulic systems still have pressure. I get turned back towards the target. You know what's worse than seeing the first missile? It's seeing the second one. So Paul and I go through this whole process together. Same thing all over again. Second missile missed, did not detonate. We eventually get into our 30-degree dive on Shaiba Airfield. We get the ordnance off. It wasn't until the next day you find out that you actually hit it. When we finally get the intel photographs, but that really got my attention. That this is really a dangerous business we're in. It's important. You've got to stay focused. When bullets are flying at you, missiles are flying at you, you tend to resort to your least common denominator of your training. So it's good to be very well trained, because you're not going to be able to operate at 100%, but you're hopeful that you can do this at 90% and still, or maybe 80% and still be successful. And I think because of the leadership of CAG Buren and Terry Toms and all the squadron COs and the skipper of the ship and the admiral, we were able to function at a very high level and be very successful.
Thank you, Senator. Captain Buren, you referred to earlier to the special characteristics of Airwing 5. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that for our audience and what made Airwing 5 unique at the time?
It was not only unique, but it was unique in the best possible way. We were the only carrier involved where basically every airplane could fly and complete a mission. Now, there were other missions I don't want to detract from, but for instance, on Ranger, they had two A6 squadrons, which were superb. But as we all know, there wasn't much of an air war. And at that time, and actually because of that time, the F-14s then couldn't drop bombs. So they provided a lot of support, but they couldn't, participate in the air-to-ground activity, as opposed to Midway, where the Hornets could fly, they could launch anti-radiation missiles, and they could drop bombs, they could do air-to-air things. The A6s, of course, did most of the bombing, particularly at night, for things like that. So it was a very unique. There were, and I think of the 6 carriers, there was only maybe 2 that had similar air wings. There were some. The Navy only had was transitioning at that time and had several different types of air wings. Rangers was different than Roosevelt's, which was different than Midway's, and it turns out that Midway's was probably the ideal for Operation Desert Storm. And I was one that Mark mentioned on the readiness. Again, I was before CAG-5, I was at Air Attack, the commander for all the carriers, and funding was always an issue. And when I was CO in A6 Squadron with the island, funding was always an issue. How much flight time could you do? And you worked up, you had low funding, and then as you got closer to deployment, you got funding. Midway, we never had that issue. Matter of fact, we were the only air wing, I think, ever that had to turn money back in because we couldn't fly it on. So our state of readiness, which is, of course, what you would hope for from a forward deployed air wing, our state of readiness was always very high. And that assisted us, I think, in not only flying all those sorties and dropping all that ordnance and not having any losses also.
Thank you, Captain.
Yeah, big deal.
Captain Hacker, as a tactical aviator, you had the unique experience of actually having to fight the air war from a command center. Could you relate for us what it's like waging a high-tech air war inside a carrier command center?
Well, I spent pretty much my entire life in the TFCC in the war room throughout Desert Storm, so it was space just like this. And we were responding to the daily air tasking order to start with. And we did have as Jim just mentioned, Ranger's Air Wing was a one-of-a-kind at the time. It was called the Grumman Air Wing. We had 2 large A6 squadrons and 2 F-14 squadrons, and then the rest of the Air Wing EA6s and S3s and helicopters, of course, and E2s. So we were kind of in a strange situation. We were the night carrier, designated the night carrier in the Persian Gulf. So, as I said earlier, the first night of the war, we launched a whole bunch of A6s into the Basra area. And their goal was to hit every type of boat that was in the harbor there. And they did a pretty amazing job. And so much of the Iraq Navy that was in port was gone in the first 2 days. Now, there were a lot of boats and ships that were out at sea that later on everybody kind of jumped on. But fighting our part of the surface warfare worked out pretty well, I thought, overall. Our admiral was Admiral Ron Zlatiper, who is a marvelous guy, another A6 guy. So it all kind of worked out with VA 145 and 155. So we didn't feel handicapped at all by being on Ranger. And like I said, it was the composite warfare concept was really getting tested, and that was that was a lot of fun, personally.
Thank you, Captain. At this stage of the program, we're going to take a brief intermission, and this will be a chance for you to be able to submit any questions or observations into our chat box. And of course, if you'd like to make a contribution to the museum, please visit our website at www.midway.org. And we'll be back with you in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Desert Storm 30th Anniversary Edition of Destination Midway. I'm Karl Zingheim, the staff historian for the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, and joining us is a quartet of Navy veterans who Operation Desert Storm during the Air War. And so we're going to resume our question and answer session, and if you have any questions or observations to make, please include them in our chat box. And so we'll go ahead and resume the round with our panelists, starting with our own Captain Jim Riley, who is the director of the docent program here aboard the Midway. And so considering all the ins and outs you have in peculiar shortage or a weird shortage that you had to suddenly take care of in the midst of war?
Well, fortunately, it wasn't toilet paper. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. I would have been fired. Actually, we were very well supplied, and that translated to very high readiness for the Airwing. And we carried almost 100,000 different kinds of parts for the aircraft and for the ship. And we worked very closely with the Aircraft Intermediate Maintenance Department. And that's the group that fixes the boxes, transceivers, that type of things that come off of the aircraft that are broken, and turn them around so that the aircraft can continue the mission. And so no significant shortages as I remember. I think there was a desire for a little more ice cream than what we were carrying at the time. But hey, you know, war's hell. So
thank you. Senator Kelly, I understand that you made a special visit to the Midway in her retirement as a museum and had a unique request to make when you came over and visited our CEO, Mac McLaughlin.
Well, if you're talking about the door to BK8, possibly, yes. Well, and I haven't just made one visit. I mean, I have visited the museum there, which I got to say, you guys have done an incredible job. I've probably been there 10 times over the years. My wife, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, and I have been on board a number of times, and everybody is so accommodating. I've had the opportunity to go to my stateroom, historic BK8, and you guys are very nice. It's not part of the museum, that part of the ship, but to allow me to have the door to the stateroom. I really appreciate that. It's something. It's one of my prized possessions, I have to say.
Thank you also for your frequent visits on behalf of the museum. We really appreciate having your time here with us. Also, let's continue with Captain Buren. In spite of the fact that you were a rather senior officer, albeit still in a flight status, could you relate to us what was probably the most memorable combat mission that you performed during Desert Storm?
Uh, Probably the most memorable one was about 4 or 5 days into the war. I flew a mission led by someone that Mark forgot to mention as a leadership guy, but I'm sure he would add Jamie Kelly, who was the XO of the VA-115 to Skipper Tom's. And we did a mission, probably our deepest mission into Iraq, probably 100 miles into Iraq to take out some bridges over the Euphrates River. And it was memorable in that going in, there was a lot of small arms. We were above most of it. Not very many missiles, but we did go by. It was very interesting. We saw a missile lift off and come up towards us, and we were about to react to it when we realized basically it was a ballistic missile and it was a Scud. And so as we were proceeding northbound to the target, the Scud was proceeding southbound. I will say I think we were more successful in our mission than it was. But to go that far into Iraq and get most of the opposition that I'd seen, other than early in the war down low, was probably the most memorable one.
Thank you, Captain. Captain Hacker, another problem that had to be anticipated and contingency provided for during Desert Storm was the fact that Iran was still very much a hostile nation then as it is now, and there was a possibility perhaps that Iran might jump into the conflict, particularly on your flank. What kind of precautions were taken by the naval forces just in case the Iranians made a surprise entry?
Well, you're right. Being in the vicinity of that long coastline from Iran was a constant factor in our thought processes on Ranger. And that was one of the good uses for the F-14s, to be up there and being controlled on our eastern flank, as it were. So they got a lot of time going up and down, not in Iranian airspace, but right up to the edge and taking a look on a full-time basis. So that coastline was never out of our thought processes on Ranger.
Thank you. Senator Kelly, we understand that you'll need to be departing shortly for other business back in the Capitol, but while we still have you, could you please give us a pilot's perspective of operating and flying the extraordinary Grumman A6 Intruder?
Well, the great thing about the A6, and I've flown a lot of airplanes, but the A6 is the only airplane I've flown operationally. As a test pilot, I flew the F-18, T-38, EA-6B, and the opportunity to fly a lot of other airplanes, you know, one or two times, F-16 being one, Mirage 2000, AMX, you know, even the space shuttle. The special thing about the A6 is that it could carry a lot of ordnance a long distance off of an aircraft carrier. And that's kind of a rare thing. An F-18, as I think a lot of us realize, you know, has you know, rather limited range and requires a lot of extra tanking capability. And you know, I think when you think about this historically, one of the reasons why the A6 was around for so long is because of the combination of those two things: being able to carry a lot of ordnance to a target and then delivering it accurately on the target. When you look at weapon systems we've purchased as a nation, you know, some of the most successful systems, the one that comes to mind is the B-52. I mean, this airplane is possibly going to be around in the United States Air Force. I mean, who knows? It could make it to 100 years. You know, that is not out of the question. And the reason is, like the A6, obviously a much bigger airplane, launches off a big runway, started out as a strategic bomber, but it's got the same combination, right? It can carry a lot of ordnance and has a very, very long, combat radius and a lot of range. So I think that's the thing that made the A6 rather unique. We could also deliver ordnance in any weather. At the time, that was more of a unique capability, and but it required a lot of crew coordination. Some of the didn't have a lot of defensive systems on board, couldn't turn with another airplane very well. So if you wound up in a situation with an enemy fighter that you had to deal with, you realized as the pilot you're probably going to come out on the losing end of that scenario. So we relied on other airplanes for support. But I tell you what, I love the A6. I love the mission and the fact that we had another crew member on board with us. That this was a team effort, and I miss the airplane. And I think but at some point, for every weapon system, we have to retire it and move on to newer and more innovative and more capable systems.
Thank you. Captain Buren, you represent the other half of the flying team for the A6 platform. Could you talk about the A6's qualities from the perspective of the bombardier navigator position?
Well, the airplane was, as Mark said, unique in its capabilities, and to utilize those capabilities, it had to be a crew effort. The DN had the FLIR, the infrared system to deliver the laser guided bombs, and the radar for other deliveries and all that sort of stuff. But you can't deliver any of that unless you get to the target and do it safely. And although you do have things to contribute as the bombardier navigator, the pilot did that, and he's the one that kept lookout and then maneuvered, as Mark indicated, with a missile from the ground. You're both looking for it, but the pilot's got to make sure it doesn't hit you if possible, if your systems don't work to prevent that. So it's the one airplane. The reason I got into A6s many years ago is because not only is it a crew airplane like an F-14, like an F-4, but you notice you don't sit like you do in an F-14 or F-4. You don't sit front and back. You sit side by side. So basically, you both know what's going on the other side. Although you have your assigned duties, there's more than one time, and I'm sure Mark has a list of them, and I do too, where you've done something that the pilot really should be doing or missed or helped, and you're there to help them out. You're not sitting, there's not a divider between you. So you've each got your specific duties, and one of those includes crew duties, which means cross-referencing each other. What's going on? What are you doing? Did you do this? Did you get this? I see this here. Things like that. So a unique airplane in capabilities, and I think even more unique in terms of crew concept. I don't think there's been another airplane before or since that has that unique combination.
Captain, I believe we have some questions from our viewing audience that we'll entertain at this time. And this is a question for Senator Kelly from Donna. Growing up, did you always dream of being an astronaut, or did being a fighter pilot inspire all that?
Yeah, I remember being, I grew up in New Jersey and being around, 7 years old, and telling my dad that I wanted to be an astronaut. And this was during the end of the Apollo mission. I remember him telling me something like, he said, "Well, son, there aren't many of them, and they're really smart." So maybe I set it aside for a while. But by the time I was in high school, I realized if having the opportunity to go in space was something that was actually there for me, and if I worked hard enough, I would at least try to accomplish that goal. But what I never wanted to do is to do things that I didn't enjoy to get there, and didn't think it was necessarily the right decision for me. So I went into the Navy, not to become an astronaut. I went in the United States Navy because I wanted to fly airplanes off of an aircraft carrier because it is the most challenging thing to do in aviation, especially trying to land on an aircraft carrier at night, especially trying to land aboard the USS Midway at night. By far the hardest ship to get aboard. It's a whole nother level of, carrier aviation, landing on the Midway at night, which I've done over 100 times. This is kind of sad. I have 299 landings on the USS Midway. I could not get that 300th one. But I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted to be a naval aviator. Now, fortunately, that was also a good path to get me to what my ultimate goal was, which was to be the first person to walk on the planet Mars, which I failed at, miserably. That didn't happen, but it was a great experience to get to go into space 4 times and command the space shuttle a couple times and be the last commander of Space Shuttle Endeavour. My kids like to remind me that both my airplane, my aircraft carrier, and my space shuttle are now all in museums. So.
Thank you very much, Senator, and we appreciate your participation here in our special commemoration. We've got another question. This one's coming from Vincent, and it's for Captain Jim Riley. And Vincent wants to know, psychologically, was there any kind of shift in going about the duties of the supply department now that you're in wartime conditions than in normal deployment routine?
Yes, I think so. I think there actually was some anxiety among the team, right? Because we didn't know what Saddam Hussein had up his sleeve. He was known to launch chemical warfare against his own population. We knew the Iraqis were sowing mines in the Gulf. And as big as a carrier is, you don't want to hit a mine. And so a little bit of anxiety. In terms of overall safety, though, I would, in fact, one of the parents wrote a letter, and I wrote back. Now, this is for the supply guys, right, that are doing inventory and warehousing. And I said, your son is safer on the Midway than he is on driving I-5 to Los Angeles. And so, for the support guys back there, on the ship, and it represents a pretty huge portion. I mentioned 500 and some in supply and over 500 and some in engineering, just to keep the ship, to generate the steam and keep the ship going. So a little bit of anxiety. Once we got into it, it was just, hey, we're doing what we've trained to do for our entire careers, and that's a very exhilarating experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a question here from Kathy, and she wants to know, did any Midway pilots have to eject from enemy fire striking their aircraft? And I guess the best one to pose that to would be the Airwing commander, Captain Buren. Did we have to have anyone eject for any reason in Desert Storm?
No, we had no losses during Desert Storm at all. No casualties, and actually one very, very minor battle damage on an airplane. But no, overall it was the Midway not only performed well in terms of sorties and delivering ordnance, but no losses and no ejections from any of the aircrew.
Okay, we got a follow-up question on that theme. One of them was a contingency. Was there a policy with Airwing 5 leaving it up to individual pilots as to whether they'd carry personal firearms with them in case they had to defend themselves on the ground if they were shot down?
Yes. Our pistols were available to all aircrew, and it was the aircrew's option whether they wanted to take them or not. Most, I think, I would guess that 80% did carry firearms, but it was not a requirement, no.
Okay, thank you, Captain. Captain Hacker, Alice from Phoenix would like to know, you mentioned something called an Alpha Sierra assignment. Could you elaborate a little more on what that meant?
Sure. Composite warfare has a whole set of warfare commanders. You have the overall warfare commander, who's called Alpha Bravo. You have the Strike Warfare Commander, which is Alpha Papa. You have the Air Warfare, which is Alpha Whiskey. We didn't have any subsurface, so that wasn't an issue. And then Alpha Sierra is the Surface Warfare Commander. And it's basically to establish maritime superiority.
All right. For Captain Buren, we have another question, and this one is from Alan in Montgomery. He would like to know if you had any overriding concerns as the leader of Airwing 5 going into combat for the first time.
No, not really. We had a very small smattering of people who had been in combat before, but primarily we had some people who had been on the strikes into Libya, to a one-time event. So there was no real, split between experience. Almost no one had been in combat before, so there was no real concern, as has been elaborated many times as we've talked about this. The workups, the unique training cycle and makeup of the Midway and the Midway kind of assisted us in that. And just like we went from blue bombs to real bombs overnight, crews went from flying training missions to flying combat missions. I won't say seamlessly. It affected different people different way, but it was an easy transition. And no, I had no real concerns about anything with the Airwing. I was very confident that they performed well, and Midway would support whatever we needed to do, and that's what happened.
Thank you, Captain. One thing to point out about the unique characteristic of Operation Desert Storm as an American conflict was that it was a very different mindset at home about the conduct of a conflict compared to what had happened in the preceding one, which was the Vietnam War. And so I'd like to kind of change the theme a little bit here with our concluding questions and to ask each of our panelists if they could come up with their best reflections on what the homecoming was like. In particular for Midway, that meant coming back through various Far Eastern ports, and including the home port at Yokosuka. But this was a decidedly different kind of reception for the return of the Warriors than, say, what had happened at the end of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So, Captain Riley, what happened when you had your homecoming in Yokosuka?
Oh, the homecoming was fabulous. So, and part of that is understanding the country of Japan and knowing that they got most of their oil from the Gulf right through the Indian Ocean and up in the Pacific, and what we did was to maintain that source of supply that fed their economy. So there were parties and celebrations, and it felt just terrific that these people in the street, if you're wearing your uniform, would stop and want to shake your hand and that type of thing. Dramatically different than the end of Vietnam, when people would be booing and worse, and so it was quite a difference.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Captain Buren, you likely began your naval career at the time that Vietnam was drawing down. Did you notice a distinct difference in the reception at the conclusion of Desert Storm from what you may have remembered at the beginning of your career?
As Jim mentioned, the differences, I'd be interested after I answer this in hearing what Dan and how Ranger did come with that, because our Japan situation was unique. They not only did we have the fly-in, but I've got recordings of the television coverage of our fly-in where newsmen are crying, literally crying on the air about us coming back. And then the Japanese took the airfield at Atsugi. There's a big football-sized field. They had a giant, basically, party for us. And they had probably 20, 30 very, very old Japanese there, many of them World War II veterans, who were literally would cry and come up to me and bow and talk about being a warrior. And so that I think it was still positive for the people in the U.S., but in Japan it was the other end of the spectrum from the Vietnam things. That they were just they couldn't do enough, and they couldn't be more proud of us, even though working there, and another story on training there and some of the issues we had. But I mean, we were heroes to them, true heroes, and it was impressive.
Captain Hacker, your career also began in the late Vietnam era, and in your case, you had to ride the Ranger across the long trip back with the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean to get back to San Diego. Could you relate to what the reception was when the Ranger returned to CONUS?
Well, first let me say that coming back to San Diego, you get to have two receptions, because when you go through Hawaii, you get a reception there too. And then you get to San Diego and you get another one. And I think Desert Storm was a huge difference in the perception of the U.S. military. It kind of turned all the bad news from Vietnam around, I think. And we were just lauded by everybody. It was an amazing difference from Vietnam. Yeah.
Would you agree that there would be something unique about San Diego's perspective, because we very much are a Navy town, and that perhaps that may have had something to do with it?
Oh, I think that's certainly part of it. I grew up in San Diego, so as far as I know, San Diego's always been a Navy town. And we have a huge Marine Corps contingent in San Diego County. So probably compared to New York City or Seattle, well, Seattle has but some of the other cities around the country, like San Francisco, I think the perception of the military was always a little bit better than some other places.
Thank you. This concludes our commemoration of the 30th anniversary of Operation Desert Storm. But before we go, I'd like to be able to make a special thank you to all of our participants here, who not only for their career services, but for the valor that they demonstrated while being exposed to enemy threat during Operation Desert Storm, on behalf of not only the rest of us here with the Midway Museum, but on behalf of a grateful nation. We thank each and every one of you for what you did 30 years ago, and for the years before and after that as well. For viewers who would like to watch more of this, you can catch this later on our website. If you'd like to make a contribution on behalf of the Midway Museum, please visit our website at www.midway.org. For further information, please also visit our website for our regular blog, Karl's Corner, which can be found there, and to tune in for our next episode of Destination Midway by following us on social media. So with that, we sign off here from the Tactical Flag Command Center on board the USS Midway, and bid you all a fond farewell, and we'll see you next time.
Yay!
Off here. Out there, clear.
Great job.
Good job, guys. Fantastic.